Would like to welcome everyone, all the participants back to the IESBA CAG virtual meeting. Regardless of where you are in the world, good morning, good night, afternoon, evening, and also welcome all the official observers to the CAG. Want a specific recognition at the beginning here again of Dr. Stavros Adamadakis, the IESBA chair, and his deputy chair, Carolyn Lee. Also, we will have Len Dewey, the IAASB deputy chair, and he is also the group task force chair on the IAASB side for the first presentation at least. And then Dr. Yagui Chen, who is observing the meeting on behalf of the PIOB. Also would like to welcome our presenters. I'll do this right now. Sylvie Soulier, who is the former IESBA member, and she is the current, she's the engagement team and group audits independence task force chair. Richard Fleck, the former IESBA deputy chair, and he is the Long Association Post-Implementation Review Working Group Chair, and Lauran Friedrich, who is an IESBA Technical Advisor and the Benchmarking Working Group Chair. In today's session, just to tell you what we'll be going through, there'll be 3 presentations. The first one will be an update on the engagement team group audits independence project, including the task force proposed revision to important definitions in the code, such as engagement team and audit team, and the draft strawman of changes to Part 4A of the code to address independence considerations in a group audit. The second presentation will be an update on the IESBA's Long Association Post-Implementation Review Phase 1, and the working group intends to present its final report to the board in December. The last presentation for the day will be the benchmarking project that you might recall. We received a presentation from the US SEC staff on recent revisions to the SEC auditor independence rules. And today we'll get a presentation on the working group's recent activities that involve the benchmarking of our standards with theirs. And it'll present its final report for the board's approval. Again, that'll happen in December. So with that, I'd like to invite Sylvie Soulier to go ahead with the engagement team group audits independence presentations. Sylvie, the floor at this point would be yours.
Thank you, Galen. I just wait to have the screen on, perhaps on presentation view. Thank you very much. And let's move directly to the first slide. So thank you, Galen, for your introduction. The purpose of our session today is really to update the CAG of all the work that has been done by the task force on engagement team and group audit. We were very busy since we presented to you last time. Of course, we are now getting ready. We hope to get an exposure draft approved in December. So I would say that now our strawman is moving closer to an exposure draft. And over the last months, we have taken a lot of views, feedback, comments from the CAG, of course, when we had the presentation last time, from the board, but also we had some outreach activities. And so we will give you an update on that. Also an update of the coordination activities with the ISA 600 task force. And I'm quite pleased to see that Len Jui is joining this session. We have been working very, very closely with Len Jui and the staff of ISA 600 over those months. And I will expose to you, the type of coordination activities we have done. Of course, we will go to the core element of that discussion, which is where we stand today on group audit independence. And also to give you really the near final approach where we are on engagement team provisions, reflecting ISA 220. And taking also in our workstream a number of additional considerations that we receive from various coordination activity with IESBA as the result of the quality management standards. So let's move on to the next slide. So the way we will organize the discussion today is to start with some element of background. Really some of the key points that were given to us by the CAG, by some stakeholders, and that were feeding our thought and our work. Update also on everything we have done on coordination with ISA 600 task force and with the resulting work product that are on your agenda paper. The section 4.5 on group audit, and I will go over some of the changes and the suggestions that how we have addressed some of the suggestions that we received. And after a group audit, we will look at where we stand on engagement team, which is for us near final foreign exposure draft. And at the end, I will conclude with the work to be still to be done and our timeline. Of course, as usual, we will pause for comments and questions, so to give you plenty of time to comment and to have some more interactive session. So as I was explaining, of course, the task force does not work in isolation. We take a lot of input and feedback from the CAG and various stakeholders. And we have been pretty active over those last months. In particular, since we presented to you and we took your comments, we also received input from various virtual calls with NSS, but also with IOSCO, IFER, and also outreach with the Forum of Firm. So those were more like, I would say, like official virtual meeting with presented our work and had the opportunity to have some discussions on some points. And of course, we continue to have a regular interaction and outreach with various members of the board as well. So to give you a very quick summary of what were the topics in general that gathered really a lot of interest from various stakeholders, including yourselves. We continue to need to provide clarification on the role and the independence of external experts. You remember you raised that point. We gave you already the answer that today it is outside our scope, but the board is absolutely aware that it is something that they will need to address, perhaps in one of their next projects. There were a lot of interrogations, more because we didn't know exactly where to go. We were expecting some possible additional work from IESBA on service providers and clarification. And actually, the two task force worked to see whether anything was necessary here. And there were also a number of questions on the individuals performing quality reviews, depending on their role, what type of independence requirement they would have in the, and do they belong to the engagement team. On group audit independence, particularly when we were talking to IOSCO and IFER, we received some feedback about the enforceability of the proposed provision that we have in the strawman. There were some concerns about how feasible it is to identify the components and link that with the concept of related entities in the code. So we had some good discussion with IFER for that. And we had also suggestions that we had not anticipated, particularly from the former firm, about when you have mergers, when you have new component auditors joining the team, giving some guidance. And we had also some suggestion to broaden our comment base. I mean, our stakeholder base, particularly with the investor community. We work on the effective date, and all the stakeholders also encourage us to continue the coordination with IESBA. So let's move to the next slide, perhaps. So as I say, coordination with ISA 600 for us really is a given. I mean, it started the entire project. The entire project on working on group audit was driven by the coordination activity with IESBA and continue as a very strong coordination activity between the two task forces, ISA 600 and engagement team group audit task force. The coordination in those days and ages are mostly about teleconference and emails. Of course, we had a lot of teleconference and email exchanges, particularly between the two task force, and also a lot between the supporting staff level. It was almost weekly at some point, but generally at least bi-weekly catch-ups. And we also had a number of joint task force teleconference in August and September. So actually it was the task force teleconference with the full task force, and we also had some preparation work with the just the chair and the staff of the two task forces. And those were extremely beneficial because it helped each task force to ask a question one to another to obtain clarification. So of course we discussed as matters the terminologies. We really are trying to be as aligned as possible between the two task forces. For us at the IESBA task force, it was very important to clarify the area of focus, to understand the priorities in the calendar from ISA 600, so we could also shape our own calendar and priorities based on how their work was moving forward. ISA 600 is expecting to approve their final standard in December 2021, and actually they are meeting after the IESBA meeting, so we are also working on some way to have ongoing discussion together to make sure that we can manage the calendar and the either overlap or one sequence after another to make sure that we have a full alignment with our work. Some additional work that we have done also is some task forces looking at the draft from the other task force, providing some comments, providing also some suggestions, drafting suggestions. I mean, and it worked very, very well. So we work very closely together and to demonstrate that we have Len Jui joining our CAG session today. Let's move on to the next slide. What I would suggest is to talk about group audit first and engagement team second. Group audit first, it's because it's really what has been the core of the work of that our task force. And this is, I would say, the strawman with new and completed content compared to what was presented to you last time. So very quick reminder, the structure of our proposed section 404 is not really changing based on what we presented last time. It is still a section entirely dedicated to address all independence requirements for component auditors. which, if you remember, is new in the code. That was the concept of component auditor was not mentioned in the code, so we are really talking about group audits. It is really addressing independence of non-network component auditors. There was a lot of expectation that the code would finally have some guidance about that. So that section is really dedicated to that. Of course, there is some application material to clarify independence requirement for team members with the example. And a significant part that we spent some time discussing last time with you is the provision on breaches, independence breaches in the context of a group audit, and that are also linked to a number of expectations on communication with those charged with governance. So the section 4 or 5 is one single place in the code where we will find all that. Let's move to the next slide. To start our new strawman, because, and that was also the result of the coordination and discussion with ISA 600, when we are talking about group audit, there are a number of terminologies that we really need to clarify and define in the code. As today, you know, the code is not written with the view to address group audit in general. It's mostly drafted or written to address what we call a standalone audit or statutory audits. So to be able to make sure that we are clear about the wording that we are using and the wording actually that is in ISA 600, we felt the need to have a section in the beginning of 4 or 5 which would be clarifying a certain number of terms. Many of those terms actually are lifted directly from ISA 600, but so they are not typical IESBA definition, but we felt it was important that those terms were clearly explained in the code as well, since we are using them. And then there are some other terms that we needed to create also to mirror what we have in the existing code, and to make sure that people will be clear about what we are talking about. So on the slides here, you will see that we have a few definitions that we're putting together that are with the gray background. Those are directly lifted from ISA 600, and there will be some a bit later in the slide, no gray background, just the white one, that are leveraging those terms and creating what we need for the purpose of the code. So, of course, it is not a surprise to see that in the extant code, we define financial statement, but for the purpose of 4 or 5, we need to talk about group financial statement. Similarly, we're talking about group audit or group engagement partner. Terminology like component and component auditor are also necessary for us to be understood to develop the provision. So here we are lifting the definition from ISA 600. If ISA 600 task force, when they will be approving a final pronouncement or making certain changes in the definition, we will necessarily have also to adjust and align. So there are the current definitions. If they are changed, we are monitoring that, working with them, and we will make sure that we use exactly the same definition. Let's move to the next slide. So as you see, because the code uses some very specific concept and provisions, using, I would say, the core definition in the prior slide, we also need to use or to define some additional terminology. The code, for instance, defines independence for individuals, professional accountants who are individuals, and professional accountants who are firm. And they are not necessarily the same definition. So we need to introduce what we mean by the firm in the context of a group audit, which is why we are talking about group auditor firm. Similarly, when we are talking about independence, we need to clarify what are the entities for which independence is required. You know that in the current code today, we're talking about the audit client, which includes the entity under audit and what we call the related entities. So we need to mirror that. So leveraging the definition in the prior slide, we need to define group audit client, which will be all the entities for which independence will be required in the context of the group audit. And also because similarly, we need to continue to be fully aligned to ISA 600. We are also defining a component audit client. And you remember we were saying that it is important for us to clarify the linkage between a component as defined under ISA 600 and related entities as we use in the code. So we are clarifying some scenarios. For instance, the component audit client, when a component is an entity, it is the simple situation, simple scenario. It will include the entity and the control related entities. But ISA 600 goes beyond that. They are disconnected the legal structure of a group with the way an audit is performed. And when they define component could be business units or functional activity. So for the code, we had to also look at that possible scenario. And in this case, we define the component audit client, starting from that business unit or function or activity, and we create the necessary linkage with the legal entities, because we need that to explain to the users of the code with respect to which entity independence is required. So those are the additional definitions that we are introducing to make sure that the way we are expressing independence will be comprehensive and also will be able to address the various scenarios under which ISA 600 is written. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, so there are some additional definition that we need to introduce to be able to have all the pronouncement, which is the definition of auditing. I will come back later to the definition of auditing for the code in general, but in the context of a group audit team, we have to be very clear and modify that definition to explain, you know, when we're talking about audit teams, all the individuals who are expected to be independent, who they are when we're talking about a group audit. So this is a definition. For instance, if we look at the first element, I would say, of a group audit team, it includes the engagement team for the group audit, including component auditors. So we have to be very precise here and introduce where component auditors are integrated. So those are, as I say, I would say this is providing all the basis and the needed vocabulary. So our section will be clearer and we will know exactly which individuals we have to be independent of which entity. That's the whole purpose of us, to try to be extremely precise in our definition in the context of a group audit. I think if I go to the next slide, this is the question part. So let's go back perhaps to 1 or 2 slides back, and I will pause here. And of course, we'll take any comment or question you may have.
Okay.
Including from the beginning, before I talked about the definition. If you have question, of course, on the coordination, etc. I am.
Okay, well, Sylvia, thank you for that brief introduction, and let me make just a couple comments. So, and want to make sure that the participants and our observers understand that you know, we had the board will be meeting next week on this particular presentation for consideration of going from a working group to a task force to an actual exposure draft. So this will be a great opportunity for the CAG to get some input prior to that. And now, Sylvie, one of the things that always has vexed me with group audits is the role of the group auditor. In the past, it really hasn't been clear in my mind why, but can a group auditor also be a component auditor at the same time? That had always been a little bit confusing to me. Might you be able to, you know, comment on that little bit of confusion in my head? And then we'll take comments from the CAG.
Sure. I would say that, and this is why the introduction on some terminology is so important, because when we talk about group auditor firm, group auditor component, we need to know who we are talking about. So let's say that we have a group audit. So we have a large group, you know, which is audited. It audits. We are talking about the group auditor firm. They issue the opinion for the entire group. This is usually what is the firm, and usually we expect that the firm and the network firm of that group auditor firm would be independent. So this is the I would say the usual approach in the code. But when we are talking about the audit of components, they can be done by 2 different types of firms. They could be done by the group auditor firm, you know, they can do the group audit plus some components. It can be done by a network firm, and it is usually very common in a group audit. So there is, I would say, the main core firm doing the group audit, and they are using some other firms in their own network to do audit work on the component. So this is I would say, the most common situation. But there are a lot of situations also where it is not possible, or for many other reasons, which is also historically, geographic. There could be some component auditors outside the network, and they are also contributing through their work to the group audit. So we are talking, I would say, about 3 different types of firm. The firm at the top issuing the opinion on the group audit. Some network firm of that firm, so they are within the same network and they are contributing to the audit. And some additional firms, I would say third-party firms outside the network, that are also component auditors, and they are also contributing to that group audit. So actually, the complexity of the section that we are creating here is to say, if you have a group audit, who has to be independent of what? Clearly. So that's really the entire purpose of that project.
Well, Sylvie, going back to my question though, can the group auditor also be a component auditor at the same time, or are they? If you're a group auditor, are you just going to be referred to as a group auditor? Forget about the component aspect of it.
To the extent that as a group auditor, they have the highest expectation of independence, I would say that it is not necessary to look at the independence requirement for the group and just for one component, even if they audit one component. Because just by making the group auditor, their expectation is capturing everything.
Okay.
So I would say technically it's possible. They could be both, but we would only focus on them doing the group audit because that captures everything.
Okay, that's a little bit different, it sounds like. All right, well, I see a number of questions popped up from our representative. Conchita, I see you first. You have the floor. Conchita?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I actually have 2 points at this stage. The first one is to give my insight on the question of Galen. That is, can a component auditor be also the lead auditor? I think that's the question. I'm using the term lead to say that, translating it also to partners in charge. There are many audit partners here, and you're referring really to a group audit partner, meaning the one leading it, right? Because you're talking of several entities being audited belonging to one group. If we put it in context, I believe a component auditor or a component auditor is also can be the lead auditor as well. Let's say it's a multinational company and the head office or the main operations is in the United States. And so it is the biggest operation, but they have operations also elsewhere in the world, covering several jurisdictions. So each jurisdiction will have an auditor, a partner in charge. But the partner in charge of the bigger operations, let's say in the United States, can be the lead. So it is both a component and at the same time the overall. I don't know whether I'm being clear in my statement. So that's one view that I would like to say. And perhaps the other point is maybe we can introduce another term, and that is the lead audit partner, meaning the one leading the entire caboodle of audits. Because the partners are all audit partners. They are all engagement partners in their respective jurisdictions. But the one leading it may be called a lead group audit partner. I don't know, something like that, just to distinguish it. Thank you.
Thank you, Conchita. Sylvia, do you want to take a couple more here, and then we'll, because we already talked about Conchita's question a little bit, but you might want to add on to that.
Actually, I would like to, if possible, clarify Conchita, because I think the terminology is important. Conchita, we don't say lead partner, but we call the same, that individual is the group auditor. Perhaps we can scroll one slide above. And again, we don't want to derail from ISA 600. Can we go back one slide, please? Yeah, you see group engagement partner. This is your this is what you suggested. You call him a lead. We call it group engagement partner. This is defined from ISA 600. So that partner is defined, not exactly the way you say it, but we want to align with ISA 600. So all those elements, this is what we have, all those definitions. It's to clarify when we're talking about the firm, is it at the group, is it the network, is it outside the network? And when we're talking about individuals, also, they are all defined. Galen, perhaps now I am ready to take another comment.
Oh, okay, so Hussein, I see your hand is raised.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good night to everyone. Just thank you very much for presentation. I want to raise one issue. Actually, this is not related with this part of this. I think it's related with IESB CAG meeting, but I want to raise this issue to your concern, and then you maybe let the IESB ISA 600 working task force. I am a little bit confused with the definition of component auditor. It's include at the request of group auditor. It's an auditor who, at the request of the group auditor, perform audit work related. Especially in practice, sometimes this is exception. Generally, a group auditor determine the component auditor, but in practice, sometimes we see that some subsidiary or some investment accountant for equity method, these entities generally select their own auditor, and then also they are subject to audit according to ISAs. Therefore, group auditor generally use these component auditor work. These component auditors are not determined by group auditor. Therefore, I think this part at the request of the group auditor part should be extended to cover the exceptional case like that. This cases generally arises from as parent companies do not power to determine subsidiary or other investment auditor. This creates a situation like that. Whenever we say that at request of the group auditor, these type of exception, in practice, there are these kind of exception. Therefore, I think you should bring these issues to ISA 600 task force before completing that project. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can we take some other comments, please?
Okay. Yeah, Hyson, you have your hands up.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Galen. Thank you, Sylvia, for a very clear presentation. Of course, I have some very short intervention on the issue of group audit team. As it was said, it will include also the component auditor. And the question is, that may create some, how to say, problematic issues when the component auditor will not be within one network. And how to say, do you think is anything that will avoid the way of just engaging only network firms in this kind of group audits? That's my concern, and this may bring in creating such an audit where only the networks will work, even if they may not have the in some countries the best firms for auditing, but they have their own firm and would create such how to say, would stimulate the network firms rather than others. Okay, thank you.
Perhaps I will give some element of response here. Can we move to one slide further, please, so we can see it in next one, please? Yes. Isan, I think that there is something that I need to bring as a reminder. We are changing in the code the definition of engagement team, and I will present that later in the presentation. And it is the result of changes in ISA 220 that were approved by the IESBA a year ago. And that's one element also of this task force, of that project. And one key change that triggered changes like the one you were commenting on is that today the definition of engagement team involves or includes every individual participating to the audit, performing audit procedures to the audit. And it is regardless of their employing organization, whether they are employed by the firm, a network firm, or a third-party component auditor. So change in the definition of engagement team at IESBA has direct effect in the change of definition of engagement team or group engagement team in the IESBA code, because now we are capturing more individuals, and I would say regardless of their employment organization, or even, you know, if they could be just contractor or coming from service providers, to the extent that an individual is performing audit procedures for the purpose of a group audit, they are captured. And this is a given for us. And actually, a lot of the work that we are doing, including the change in the definition for us, reflects directly the changes from ISA 220. I see Josephine actually has raised her hand. Perhaps she brings some additional color.
Josephine, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sylvie. I was actually going to jump in and respond to Hussein's comment on the definition of a component auditor. So I can just sit back and let you complete your thoughts in this area, and just ask me to jump in when you're ready. Okay, thank you. But I think, you know, some of the comments were also directly directed to IESBA and your task force. Yeah. But it is clear that you know, and we usually say that at the beginning of our presentation on group audit. All the work we are doing today is resulting from the coordination between the two boards. So the board that really, I would say, drives our group audits are being done. And that is driving some of the key new concepts, like how is a component defined today. It is ISA 600, it is the IESBA. And what we're doing is taking stock of those changes, looking at the impact on our code, and also, I would say, filling some of the gaps that we had in the code to clarify, and to make sure using a consistent terminology, being able to clarify what are the independence needs for all those firms, whether firm, network firm, component auditor, and individuals as well, depending on their role. But at the beginning, our baseline is what is being done by IESBA, and here ISA 600. I see Caroline, you wanted to add something as well. Caroline is also a member of the task force.
Thanks, Sylvie. So I just wanted to add on in response to Heisen's question that actually the code already, in terms of independence, already has provisions that apply not just to the firm, but to network firms, whether or not they are involved on the audit. And with this change, the effect is to extend the independence requirements to others that might participate on the audit and therefore ought to be independent. So that is how we are looking at it in terms of strengthening and enhancing auditor independence. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline.
Sylvie, Hussein, asked about selection. Does it matter who selects the auditor, whether it's the group auditor or it's the component itself within its jurisdiction? He asked that question. Could you maybe touch on that?
I would say that in most situations, when the component audit is done by a network firm, the selection of the partner, the staff is done by the firm and its network. But when we're talking about component auditors outside the network, it's not the component, the group auditor that is doing that selection. They do not engage component auditors doing some other work or statutory work. Very often, those component auditors outside the network, they are already engaged by the client, the component, the group, etc. And it is because they are already doing some audit work for sometimes the sake of simplicity, to avoid having two auditors doing audits perhaps of the same thing on the same entity. It is making sense to use the work of the local component auditor firm, and this is where, when there is some interaction between the group auditor firm and the component auditor firm. So what the group auditor firm is doing is sending instructions. So there is some, because they have some expectation and certain needs to be able to use the work of the component auditor firm. But they do not select and they do not engage. Usually it is because they are already selected or engaged by the client. That's the most common situation.
So working through that, it really isn't who selects. It's sort of a mutual agreement between the client and the group auditor as to who the component would be. That's the important great thing, right?
Absolutely. And this is the work also that ISA 600. There are setting in ISA 600 some criteria to look at the qualification of a third party firm to become the component auditors firm. We in our board, we only look at the independent part, but for instance, they need to look at the quality part. For our group audit firm, they need to make sure that a component auditor firm, particularly outside the network, they've fulfilled certain criteria, not only on independence but also on quality, and it is because so they can use the work. We are only looking at one element of that, which is the independence and the ethics, of course.
I see Josephine, you still have your hand raised. Are you wanting to come back?
Yes, I'm happy to come back. Thank you on this one, just so we can clarify and very much what Sylvie has said. So we do recognise and do understand that jurisdictions may require an audit of an entity within a group for statutory, regulatory or other purposes, and therefore we have what's known as these statutory audits. And just to be clear, it's not every jurisdiction in the world, but we recognise it is a general theme. But from the ISA 600 perspective, this is the audit of the group financial statements. It's not about the individual statutory audits. It's about the response to risk of the group financial statement level. and the work that needs to be done to respond to that risk. And that work could technically be done only by the group auditor. But of course, that wouldn't practically make sense, particularly in some of these much larger groups. There are lots of different reasons why it's critically important that component auditors are involved in the group audit. So therefore, when it comes to the group auditor's responsibility, and by that I'm actually using ISA 600 terminology, but the terminology here would be group audit firm, I suspect. In terms of the group audit firm's responsibility for the group financial statements and for the opinion on that, they will reach out to those component auditors and ask them to perform work for them on the group audit. Now, in terms of the fact that a statutory audit might also be going on at the same time, we have got some material in the ISA currently as we're going through this process to December that talks about the factual point that some of this work might be going on, and there is an interaction between the group auditor and the component auditor who's performing a statutory audit from that perspective, and perhaps some of that work is relevant to the audit of the group financial statements because it is addressing the risks at the group financial statement level. And if it's relevant, then of course there's an interaction that needs to occur and for the work to be discussed. But let's not forget that is a practical aspect of the group audit team working with their component auditors. It's not about, to Sylvie's point, in respect of achieving the sufficient appropriate audit evidence, audit quality, and so forth. It's very much group audit firm led from that perspective. And then on another point, Galen, you asked the point about component auditors and can they be the group audit firm? We do accept that there may be situations where a group audit firm is so large that the group audit firm may want to treat some other individuals in other offices as part of that firm as component auditors, but it's a practical aspect. But to the extent that Sylvie answered, that's generally those network firms or outside the network firms that you will see as being the component auditors. And I see Len has his hand up, so he's probably wants to dive in.
Len.
Yeah, before that, Ken just reminded me that we have a lot to cover. So,
yeah, we do.
Okay, so yeah, Len, thank you. Yes, yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for all the comments and questions, and Hussein, thank you very much for that comment. I actually replied your email. You sent me the same questions in the email. But I just want to come in after Josephine. Josephine has been working with me for the last 5 years on the task force. So agree with everything Josephine said, but also once you use the work of the component auditor, whether it's for other purposes or of Hussein, you mentioned equity accounted investees. Once you start doing that, the audit requirements in ISA 600 apply, the direction, supervision, review. You cannot just take the audit work, audit financial statement, and put in your file. There has to be some interaction, direction, supervision, review. It's a very important concept in ISA 600. But in addition to that, I just want to say that the joint working group has been working seamlessly. I think a number of definitions you're seeing today has gone through a number of calls, and I really appreciate IESBA in terms of what they've done in terms of incorporating the definition for ISA 600 into the code you see today. So there's still a number of meetings scheduled and all the work needs to be followed up, starting with this Friday. We'll have a joint task force call, but I just want to thank all the CAG members for your input.
Thank you, Len. If I may, considering really that we have a lot to cover, perhaps we can move on to the next part of the presentation, because we were just talking about some of the definition here, but we need to go into the core of the strawman. So perhaps let's move on a few slides. Yeah. So following some of the CAG advice in our last meeting, the section 404, as I say, really is all about independence in the context of a group audit. And we really follow the recommendation to try to be as simple and straightforward as possible in the new provision that we are drafting. So we wanted to have mostly approach rather than redrafting an entire code, putting some right cross-reference between that new section and I would say the generic part of the code. So, and by highlighting what are the relevant parts in the extant code to be applicable, and also using the defined term that we were just presenting to you above. So we just reclarify when we're talking about individuals, and you see we are referring to some of the terminology we just exposed to you, like group audit team, group audit client. So we are just identifying those individuals, those entities, and highlighting what requirements are applicable for individuals from the group auditor firm and from the network firm of a group auditor firm. Those requirements, I would say that firms have been applying for years, but it was not very explicit in the code. So our new section now is using the right terminology and the right cross-reference. So there is no ambiguity that the full independence requirements are applicable to individuals, group auditor firms, and their network firm. Move on to the next slide, please. So when we're talking about component auditors outside the network, I'm just putting here on the screen the principles that we have been applying, I would say, for the entire work of that our task force that were presented. Actually, that class was presented already twice to the CAG, but it's very important because it sets the principles that the board agreed that the CAG was presented with, and that we presented to IESBA, IFER, firm, and how we are looking at which framework we would apply in which situations. So we have a number of scenarios when we have the group itself is a public interest entity or a non-public interest entity. You have those two cases. And you have the situation where the component itself is a public interest entity or a non-public interest entity. So we have 4 scenarios here. And that slide really summarized what had been the principle, the governance principle for us since the very beginning that has been agreed, which is the framework to apply is the framework of the group. We are talking about group audits. So the independence requirements that will govern the situation of a group is the status of the group itself, whether it is a public interest entity or a non-public interest entity. Having that in mind, which is the reminder, let's move to the next slide, how that is translated in the words. So can we move on? Okay. So actually the way we are addressing in our strawman, we are clarifying what are the independence considerations that are applicable to component auditors firm outside a group auditor firm. As I explained earlier, our entire project is really to fill some of the gaps. So there was nothing about what were the independence consideration applicable to component auditors outside the network firm. And this is what we are putting in now in the code. And clearly putting, I would say, a black and white requirement of independence that when you are a component audited firm outside the group auditors firm network, and you contribute to the group audit, you have to be independent of the component audit client. You remember the way we define it, it is the component and the related entities of the component as well. So it clarifies that independence is required under the code, and to which entity independence will be applicable. And there are actually, we are just mirroring, I would say, what is in the extant code. But we are adding also consistent in a way that is consistent with the code, some additional requirement on having a direct or material indirect financial interest at group level. If a component auditor's firm audits a component, they cannot have a direct or material indirect financial interest in the group itself, the entity above. So those are really the principles that were in the prior slide, translated into a simple requirement with cross-reference to the code, and also some application material, which is exactly what we were discussing earlier when you was a situation where you are the component auditor's firm also doing the statutory audit for other purposes than the group audit, and a reminder that in this case, you also have to make sure that as a component auditor, you follow all the applicable independence requirement also for the purpose of your statutory audit. Let's move on to the next one. Okay. Some additional application material that we are introducing, which is also to mirror what is in the extant code, are some good reminders to apply the conceptual framework of the code. In particular, that you just not apply, the code is not rule-based, it's principle-based. So it constitutes some kind of reminders that, yes, there is clear requirement that you have to be independent of the component and the controlled entity. But a component auditor needs to go to have a look at the broader picture, and there could be some unique circumstances where it would make sense in application of the conceptual framework to expand or at least to look at the independence rate outside those entities. And also remind the component auditor to apply the framework, so identify, evaluate, and address the threats to independence created by other interests, other relationships. We can move on to the next slide as well. We also thought that it would be helpful to put some application material for a few specific situations. The first one is non-assurance services. You know that the IESBA has adopted some new provisions on non-assurance services, including some specific prohibitions of services where there is a self-review threat. And we, the task force, was thinking that it was helpful to clarify the situation of a self-review threat or not self-review threat in a situation where you have a component auditor's firm doing the audit of a component. And how we would apply that, of course, in the context of public interest entities, and give as a reminder that you need to apply the requirement. Those are the new requirements, and that's quite important to address. If I look at the next slide, there is another element of guidance that we wanted to include. There could be some situation where the partner of a component auditor outside the network could be considered a key audit partner because of the role or of that partner, or the importance of that component for the group audits. And we wanted to highlight that there, even if a partner here is outside the firm, outside the network firm, that partner could still be considered key audit partner for the purpose of the group audit, which would trigger a number of additional provisions in relation to long association or even a rotation of the key audit partner. So there could be a situation where the partner of a component outside the firm or the network would be subject to the mandatory partner rotation that we have here. And the task force thought that it was important to highlight that possibility. We can move on also to the next one. Another element, and it is reflecting some comments that were made to us by the forum firm, is that when you have a group audit in the beginning of a fiscal year, the team of group auditor, network firm, and particularly component auditor is not necessarily fixed for 12 months or more. There could be some changes. There could be also changes in the determination of new components. For instance, it could come from a merger. It could come also from the identification of new risk based on ISA 600. And we wanted to have in the code some consideration when you have those type of changes. For instance, when you want to bring a new component auditor midway, and you need to look at a firm, and they have not, because they were not considered component auditor earlier in the period, subject to independence, and we want to look, whether they could join the team and become component auditor. We are providing, consistent with some existing provision in the code when you have merger and acquisition, some possibilities for a new component auditor to be added, and how to address potential independence situation based on the existing provision and the conceptual framework. So those are also additional application material that we added, that we thought were important as well. Perhaps I will go back to the next slide. I think at that point we do have some, question and proposals. So let's go back a few slides, and I will take some comments and questions.
Do we have any questions here? And please we still have a lot to cover. So if you can be very focused, it would be appreciated. Josephine, you still have your hand up. I assume that. Okay, you're good there. I don't see any hands up. I had a couple quick questions myself, Sylvie. If we go back to slide 13. So here in 405.7, our 405.7, we have A and B, and in B we talk about financial interests. There's nothing in here about relationships. Is that covered by A? So by relationship, business interests, employment, and so forth.
Actually, why we have A and B? That requirement is meant to address both PIs and non-PI situation. In the current code, if a statutory audit client is not a PI, you don't necessarily go up to the you don't consider the parent necessarily as a related entity, but you have a prohibition to invest in the parent of your statutory audit client based on materiality. So it's a prohibition to invest in the controlling entity of your audit client, even if your audit client is not a public interest entity. And actually what we're doing here, we are mirroring that for the component auditor participating to the group audit to make sure that we have a clear prohibition on an investment at group level. So that's what we are adding here. So that's really the investment. And for the business relationship, in the code, the business relationship is not, you don't have an absolute prohibition on business relationship. You have, for business relationship, you can have certain business relationship based on the significance and the materiality of the business relationship. So it is really done using the conceptual framework. And when we are capturing entities, I would say up and over in the group, it is the application of the conceptual framework. So that would be addressed in the application material, I would say next page, business relationship. Let me see. Yes, it is R405.9, the business relationship.
Okay. Thank you. So I see a couple of hands. And again, if you could be focused, Hussein, and then followed by Wei Meng.
Thank you. My concern is about key audit partner. Yeah, actually, for group audit, audit report signed by group engagement partner, and then therefore the key decision or judgment on significant matter should be made by group engagement partner. Therefore, I think this is my view. If for group engagement, if group engagement partner determine a key audit partner, it should be herself or himself, not a component auditor, because group audit report signed by just in my thinking, in rational way, I am a little bit confused about this statement. Thank you.
I will take another comment and then I will come back to that one. See Wei Meng.
Hello, thanks, Sylvia's presentation. Thanks a lot for the work has been done by the task force. A quick comment. I appreciate the effort made by the task force to align the independence requirement of component auditor with that of group auditor. I think it is good for the public interest. And also thanks for the work to incorporate definitions into the code. That's all, thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps let me go back to Hussein. You know, we are just reflecting what is today in the code on long association and rotation. We do have rotation provision today, and actually we have a session on rotation after this one. The long association and the rotation requirement apply to the lead audit partner. That will be the partner doing the group audits, and they have certain requirements. The engagement quality review partner also, but also what we define as key audit partners. And our approach here, and if it is done by the same firm or network firm, you could have the identification of certain key audit partners, and they are already subject to rotation. What we are saying here is when you are in the context of a group audit and you have partners, because of the work they are doing, they are considered key audit partner and therefore normally subject to rotation. We are simply saying, regardless of your organization, if you are in the firm, if you are in a network firm, or if you are in a component auditors firm outside the network, if that partner has a key audit partner role, and that is to be defined also by the group engagement partner and the team at group level, that partner will be similarly subject to rotation requirement. So here we are mirroring the code and saying if a partner is a key audit partner, rotation would apply. Galen,
yeah, if you want to move forward, I don't see any other hands.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's move on. I think we move to breaches. Yeah. So again, that slide is just a reminder about what was the proposed and presented to the CAG last time on breaches. we were proposing including some specific provision about breaches and particularly adapting what we have already in the code in the context of a group audit. And in particular, what would happen if there is an independent breach that is identified by the component auditor. So we mirror the process existing in the code and to see how it should apply if the breach is happening at component auditor. And we introduce some expected communication and exchanges between component auditors and group auditors in the situation where there is an independence breach at component auditor level. So let's move on. We spent most of the session of the last CAG session discussing that. So we took the input and we refined what we were presenting. So similarly, so we are also leveraging ISA 600, and we had a lot of exchanges with ISA 600 to make sure that not only IESBA is aligned with ISA 600, but also that ISA 600 will mirror what are the breach provision existing already in the code when they are referring in their application material to those type of situations. And we are putting, of course, in perspective the right cross-reference, which is the 14A2 provision here. So all that is, I would say, application material to put things in perspective and have the correct cross-reference. Let's move on to the next slide. And this is really the core of the requirement, because here, I mean, the current code addresses the situation where you have an auditor identifying a breach, either at auditor level or in a network firm, and then what they should do, and particular, and then how they need to have discussion with those charged with governance. Here, we are introducing another player, I would say, which is the component auditor outside the network. And we are clarifying who needs to do what and how we should address that breach. So it is the breach happening at component auditor. The component auditor has some expectation. Of course, they have to identify the breach, to evaluate, to take some, to address that breach at their level, but they also have absolutely the obligation to talk to the group auditor about the breach and the issue and the consequence of the breach and the type of action that can be done. So this is what we are setting in that paragraph, also following exactly the process that we, I mean, almost the same process that we have in the extent code. So you see that D is new, communicate the breach to the group of engagement partner with all the facts and circumstances and any proposed action. So that's the key change. We can move to the next one. Of course, there is in this case some expectation from the group engagement partner, knowing about a breach happening at component auditor. They have to make some determination whether there is a capacity to continue to use the work of that component auditor. And we are providing guidance and expectations about how the group engagement partner shall address that issue and what they need to do. And we are also looking at a number of scenarios, because depending on the significance of the breach, it could be different types of way to address it or different types of outcome. And this is where we are also bringing some more application material. What is very important here is to be able to determine that even if there is a breach, there is there or not still the possibility for the group auditor to use the work of the component auditor. That's really the key point. We can move to the next slide. So we are particularly providing some types of scenarios, you know, from the less serious to the more serious. So there could be some scenarios where even if there is a breach with some proper response, there is still a possibility to use the work of the component auditor. Or there could be some scenario where the breach is so important or so significant that actually the component auditor should stop being the component auditor. And in this case, the group engagement partner will necessarily have to find an alternative so they can continue the audit. So we are looking at all those different scenarios. And we work with ISA 600 also to make sure that there is some agreement in the way it can be managed, because those situations are a disruption, I would say, for a group audit. Let's move on to the next one. When we are addressing breaches, there is in the extent code a very important sequence between the communication between the auditor and those charged with governance at the client. Those charged with governance need to be informed and need to concur with some of the proposed resolution. We believe that in the context of the group audit, that is the same. Particularly if there is a significant breach of independence at the component auditor, of course, those charged with governance need to know about it and need to understand what happened and why perhaps the group engagement partner cannot continue to use the work of that component auditor. So similarly, and in mirror of what is the extent code, we have put in our provisions here what is the requirement on communication and what is the content of that communication and how to reach a conclusion on what to do and what would happen in case of the breach. So let's move on. I guess the next slide is open for views or reaction. So let's go back again. Yeah, and I am taking some additional comments here.
Wait a second here, Sylvia. I don't see any, but okay, Hossein, and then followed by Akito.
Thank you. I was wondering, whenever in case of breach, there's an evaluation for objectivity. I think the other fundamental principle, for example, integrity or professional care, also should be evaluated. In case of breach of independence, there may be cases not compliance with integrity or professional care. Why just only one element of fundamental principle, just integrity, the objectivity used, not integrity or other. Thank you.
Any other? Yes, I am taking some other comments.
Akito?
Thank you. I appreciate your very careful, clear presentation. It is very helpful for me to understand. Let me share one brief comment regarding the influence to other component auditors. I think that it is important point to confirm whether there are other breaches of independence in other component auditors. My suggestion is that to consider and report the influence to other component auditors may also be included as the consideration matters and reporting matters to those charged with governance in order to properly catch and review the impact on the overall group audit and response report properly based on risk-based approach. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Conchita?
Conchita,
My,
you're on mute.
my input, yeah, my input is similar to Hito's input. Basically, the point is if a breach is uncovered, is it solely the call of the group engagement partner to change, or it has to go up to those charges? It's aligned with the question.
Conchita, you're breaking up a little bit there. Can we try again? Just try to be real focused.
Yes, the point is it's aligned with what was earlier stated. That is, if the breach was uncovered, is it solely the call of the group engagement partner to make the change, or it has to be decided upon by those charged with governance?
Did you get enough there, Sylvie?
Yeah, I think I do. Hussein, I understand your point about objectivity, integrity, and the other fundamental principles. I have to say that compliance with all the fundamental principles, it's something that is expected in the, I would say, the qualification, the evaluation of the qualification of a competent auditor in general. And it is already in ISA 600. So I don't think it is necessarily omitted here. I think the focus in the context of the breach is really to evaluate the ability of the group auditor to issue the audit opinion and use the work of the competent auditor. So this is what I would say, that objectivity is really put as the core or the key fundamental principle here. It is already that way in the breach provision, and we are mirroring. But I think that your other points, integrity and professional competence and due care, is also addressed separately both by the code and ISA 600. Akihito, actually, and Conchita, actually here, the first call, I agree, is from the group engagement partner. Because, well, first, this is the responsibility of the group engagement partner to issue the audit opinion here and assess whether that it is possible to do that. But if you look at 405.20, there is that communication with those with governance and the expectation of concurrence. So it's not only the group engagement partner calls. It is done with the discussion with those charged with governance. And there is mandatory communication with those charged with governance here. So it may not be as reporting matter in the context of the communication under ISA 600, but under the IESBA code, there is an obligation to communicate all those matters of independence breaches with those charged with governance. And there is a pretty precise exchange and expectation at that point of concurrence from those charged with governance. I think I am through group audits. Galen, may I move on, or do we have another hand?
Well, we're bumping up against our break from a time standpoint, and I want to give time for Stavros and Dr. Chen to weigh in on this. So if we can move quickly, that'd be great.
I think the end will be very, very fast. If I can move. The last point, actually, we are just putting on the slide the near final definition of engagement team and audit team. We spent a lot of time last time with the CAG presenting that. We do some tweaks based on that, but the one that I wanted to clarify is a bit further slide. So let's move, Carla, if you can move to the additional elements, the definition of engagement team and audit team. So they were tweaked and they really mirror ISA 220. But now, Carla, the next one again. Yes. There were a number of additional elements for us when we were refining the definition that were brought to us by the coordination team. Between IESBA and IWSB, because they have done a full review based on changes in the QM provision, the quality suite provision from IWSB, and they have highlighted to us a number of areas in the code where possibly it would be up to our task force to make those conforming changes. So just to let you know, we looked at all those comments that were given by the coordination team, and we identified a number of changes that were editorial in nature, and it is in one of your agenda item D3. There were a number of conforming amendments, and they impact the glossary in the glossary of terms. Particularly, there were a number of comments related to the fact that now there is reference to quality management versus quality controls. So it is something that we have totally taken on board in the new definition, and we have looked at all in the glossary of terms, all the area where we need to make sure that we have alignment. There were some additional points that the coordination team suggested to our task force to take on board. But actually, when the task force looked at it, we felt that it was outside our scope. And in particular, it was in relation to reworking the definition of a network. We don't think that it is the work of the engagement team group audits, and but that was highlighted, and we will send back to the board for them, perhaps, to look at it separately. So just to clarify, the last leg, I would say, on the changes on the definition. If I go back one slide or two, so we have, I would say, a near final. Just go back one slide or two, Carla. One more. Oh no, back. Okay, so actually what you have here on the screen and what you have on the papers, I would say, is the near final definitions of that we are presenting to the board, and really with all the final alignments, as I said, based on the comments that were provided to us by the coordination team. A lot refers to refer to, for instance, engagement quality reviewer and some terminology. With that, I would like to move forward now to the end of the presentation, and then I can take one more, please. Yeah. So just a reminder of the timeline where we are. We are now in September 2021, so we are presenting to the board, and what I will say, it's not anymore a strawman, it's really a first read on our exposure draft. We believe that, there will be no additional provision that is still pending to be drafted in the view of the task force. It's close to final, and we will get, of course, all the comments from the board. Our view is to be able to approve an exposure draft for comments in December. We know that ISA 600 is expecting to entirely approve their new provision also in December. So we will be working closely together to make sure that we are as aligned as possible to their final version. So when we have an exposure draft, it will be approved pending some possible tweaks, for instance, in the definition or something like that in our exposure drafts, if they make a change, to make sure that there will be no surprise, when we issue the exposure draft, that it will not be inconsistent with the final provision approved by the IESBA.
Sylvia, if I might interject here, I think everybody can see the sort of the timeline here. And I did have one question, and then I want to make sure that Stavros and Dr. Chen has an opportunity. We're just bumping up against time. Could we go back to slide 15, if you don't mind?
Yes. And
it has to do with NAS and component auditors. This was R 405.7, or I guess it was actually A1, the explanatory, or the yes, where it's talking about inventory. And I guess my only concern here is looking at things in isolation, because as we know, inventory impacts cost of goods sold, and it can impact operations. And to look at the prohibition of NAS in isolation like this, I think almost invites sort of a notion of partial independence. And I'm not saying that you've got it wrong here. I'm just basically asking a question. I don't expect a response, but I think I would really be careful about some limitations on in this area. But that was really my only final comment, and maybe the task force could think about that a little bit. Dr. Thamadakis, did you have anything that you wanted to add, in wrapping this up?
Well, I have no significant remark at this point. I thank, of course, the presenter and the staff for the work they've done, and I thank the CAG for their contributions. The only thing I want to underline again, and Sylvie has underlined it sufficiently, but I want to underline that this is a project grown out of coordination with the IESBA. We didn't have that before, and now with coordination, we have on both sides projects that will arise due to the need for coordination. Overall, if this succeeds, it's going clearly to create and provide for a much higher quality of standard setting than we have done so far. So I think we should keep that in mind, because it is a very important strategic aspect. And again, thanks to Sylvie and the team, and to the CAG for their good comments for this work.
Thank you.
Dr. Chen, would you like to weigh in now, or do you want to wait to the end of our meeting? Dr. Yeah, there we go.
Okay, so thank you, Chairman. Yes, I do think that the proposals presented by task force are commendable and show consideration for the public interest in relation to the independence of different members of the ET. So I do not have any comments at this moment. So may I just go ahead?
Okay, thank you. Sylvia, if you wanted then, any final remarks that you might have. I'm sorry, you're on mute, Sylvie.
I would like to thank the CAG for their comment. We are taking everything on board, including I understand your last comment, Gillian, and we will actually we will highlight that to the board when we meet with them, and the task force will consider that as well. I understand absolutely your view. It looked like a focus on just one little thing. And well, thank you very much. I hope that your next meeting we will see the comments that will be received in the exposure draft.
Thanks again for all your efforts here in this area. This is a difficult area. Jeff, how long do we want to break for here? When do we want to come back?
I guess it's been a pretty intense discussion. I guess we'll still give the CAG 15 minutes, I suppose. So we can come back 5 minutes to next time. I don't know if that's how you express it, but I guess 9:55 Eastern time.
Okay, so we'll take a break then. Jim, I see you're on, and I don't know why, but I didn't recognize you, and I will in the next section, Jim Dalkin.
Oh, great. Thank you. Good to see you, Galen.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, how long is our break till?
5 minutes before the hour.
Thank you.
Jeff, I see people returning to us. Whenever you're ready, we can get started again.
Yes, I guess we'll just wait for Richard to put his screen on, and then we can start. Our next presenter, of course.
While we're waiting, waiting for that, I was somewhat derelict in my welcoming remarks by neglecting Jim Dawkins. Jim is chair of the IASB CAG, has always been with us on the ethics CAG as well, and Jim represents INTSI and his duties. But Jim, my apologies, and you're certainly welcome in our meeting. I see Richard on. Richard's going to give us this update on the post-implementation review of the long association standard. Richard, time's yours.
Sure. You can hear me?
We can now.
Good, thank you. Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. And the purpose of this session is to give you an update on where the working group has got to in evaluating the approach to be taken to one particular provision of the long association provisions. Next slide, please. What I will do is take you briefly through the background, indicate to you the comments that we've received and the key issues that have been raised, and then give you an indication of where the working group is and where IESBA is, or the feedback we got from IESBA last week. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So back in December, December 2018, we made some fundamental changes to the code to address the whole issue of familiarity threats in the audit partner relationship with the audit client. And those, the highlights of those were that we provided for a time-on period of a maximum of 7 years to cover engagement partners, engagement quality control reviewers, and other key audit partners. And we provided a framework for a cooling off period, which ranged, as you can see from the slide, for engagement partners from 2 to 5 years, sorry, extending it from 2 to 5 years for EQCRs, extending it from 2 to 3 years, and leaving key audit partners at 2 years. There was a considerable debate back in 2018 over whether the 5-year cooling off period for engagement partners was appropriate. There were a number of reasons for that, not least the position in the European Union, pursuant to the audit regulation, and also a number of countries that were in the process of reviewing their position and making some changes. As a result of that, we introduced as a compromise what has become known as the jurisdictional provision, and the jurisdictional provision runs until December the 15th, 2023. And hopefully the next slide has this provision on it, if my memory is right. Slide, Jeff. So, and that provision provides that where a legislative or regulatory body has established a cooling off period for an engagement partner of less than 5 years, the higher of that period, or 3 years, may be substituted. Hang on, I have no idea who this is, I'm sorry. May be substituted for the cooling off period of 5 years, provided the applicable time on period does not exceed 7 years. Now, that provision was given was time limited and was expressed to expire on the 15th of December 2023. Oh, forgive me. It is.
Richard, you're on mute. Richard, you're mute.
Sorry, I didn't consciously do that. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
So the purpose of the working group, or the role of the working group, is to establish whether or not the jurisdiction provision should expire as presently scheduled on the 15th of December 2023, or whether some other action should be taken. And as a result, we have conducted a survey, and next slide, please, which we issued in March, and with the comments due by the end of May. We've actually received comments through for a longer period than that, and we've of course taken those into account. Next slide, please. And next one. So we got 32 responses to our questionnaire. Sorry, go back, thank you. And as you will see, the vast majority came from professional accountancy organizations and national standard setters and the firms, but we did also get responses from the regulators and the independent national standard setters. It's important to note that the questionnaire that we published was published on the basis that it was the answers would be confidential, because one of the questions, key question was, are you intending to move to a 5-year cooling off period in the future? And we didn't think we could expect people to give us indications of what they were planning to do publicly in advance of them actually dealing with those adjustments in the future. So we had 32 responses, as I say. Most did not raise issues, but there were a group of issues raised, which I'll come on to next, please, Jeff. Next slide. And as you will see from the top, the summary at the top, the majority were raised by the professional accounting organizations, national standards setters. There were 9 individuals or respondents who raised issues. 3 firms raised issues, and 2 independent standard setters raised issues. The prime concerns were in some jurisdictions that already have conceptually different time on, time off provisions, some of which also rely on mandatory firm rotation. And their arguments were that as a result, those existing requirements might preclude people from adopting the 5-year period or introduce confusion and complexity going forward. The 2 countries that were specifically raised, there were others, were the European Union, because as I've said, their audit regulation have prescribed a 3-year period, cooling off period, and Korea, which has a different structure. Next slide, please. The second group of issues was that there would be problems raised in some of the smaller jurisdictions where the number of partners to enable effective rotation to take place would be limited, which would as a result either reduce competition and lead to market concentration, and would particularly affect small firms, particularly in small jurisdictions with small accountancy professional practices. And indeed, that was an issue raised by a number of the global firms talking about some of their smaller network firms. And then, as you'll see in the bottom, there was a number of other concerns raised. One was the absence or the potential challenges raised by having a small number of partners qualified and expert in specialized industries, which would therefore have an adverse impact on audit quality. A second second issue was we're revising the definition of a public interest entity, and what was the effect of that going to be on the market position. A third was the pandemic, and a fourth was the fact that one person felt that we hadn't given this enough time before considering whether or not it should be extended or not. So that was the position. We had asked respondents to make suggestions if they were had expressed concerns, and unsurprisingly, the proposals put forward included extending the jurisdiction, converting it into a permanent provision, adding a size exemption, which obviously would address the issues of the smaller jurisdictions and smaller firms, allow more flexibility so that you could bring into consideration other factors, safeguards, such as mandatory firm rotation, and to consider what would happen if people didn't move to a 5-year cooling off period. I think that's a pretty obvious menu of options, and came as no surprise to us. Next slide, please. So the working group considered these responses, and we have taken our current view as IESBA was that we should have regard to the fact that this is a provision that applies only to public interest entities, and we should have regard to the fact that, as a general rule, forum of firms are of the public interest entities, and they will comply to code irrespective of the jurisdictional. Next slide, please. When we considered this, we took the view that if local requirements were less stringent, the correct approach was that national standard setters and professional accountancy organizations should implement the proposed 5-year cooling off period when the jurisdictional provision expires. We looked at the European Union provision, and it's fair to say that there are two ways of viewing the particular regulation. And there are a couple of countries who made representations that said that there was to the effect that there is no right for the member state to change the 3-year period, cooling off period. The contrary view is, if you look at the box on the right-hand side and halfway down, just before the second sentence of the first paragraph, it says they shall not participate again in the statutory audit of the audited entity before 3 years have elapsed following that cessation. And the contrary construction is that before 3 years is a minimum, not an absolute period. And that is a view that is held by the majority of those that we have discussed with. More significantly, the issue is the application of the regulation to member states. It does not prevent professional accountancy organizations, national standard setters that are themselves obviously not member states, doesn't prevent them from adopting the approach that they consider as appropriate, nor does it prevent individual firms making a decision about the period that they think is appropriate. Now, there are obviously practical issues from country to country, particularly if the standard setter is established by the member state. But the fact is that the firms themselves are at liberty to apply whatever period they think, as long as it's longer than 3 years. Having considered the position and looked at the number of respondents we got from who took the view that there was no ability to extend the period beyond 3 years, was limited, a small number of jurisdictions within the European Union, we concluded there was insufficient grounds for IESBA to extend the jurisdictional provision on the basis of the legislation in Europe. Next slide, please. The second issue which was raised was the approach that said that we should have regard to the existence of other safeguards to the familiarity threat, and in particular, the mandatory firm rotation. Now, we take our analysis of that is that the partner rotation provisions address the threats attributable to individual partners' familiarity with the firm, whereas the audit client, whereas the mandatory firm rotation provisions address the institutional threats. They are therefore dealing with a fundamentally different familiarity threat. They may be interconnected, but we believe that nevertheless, they should be regarded as separate. And we have already provided, and in our strategic work program, that the issues related to mandatory firm rotation and so forth would be reviewed as part of phase 2, which is scheduled for 2023. On that basis, we did not consider that the issues flowing from the existence of mandatory firm rotation in some jurisdictions were themselves on their own a reason to extend the jurisdictional provision. Next slide, please. The other issues, the impact on small firms, is one that we obviously recognize. It's a challenge that comes back to us regularly in relation to revisions to the code that we propose. We believe that the right approach is in those situations for an exemption to be sought from paragraph 540.5 from the local regulatory body in accordance with the provision that's provided in 540.9. Frankly, we've taken the view that those issues can be managed by most of the firms that would be performing public interest entity audits so as to be able to comply with the code. And again, therefore, we do not think that that is a ground for extending the jurisdictional provision. Next slide, please. So I should just spend a moment before throwing this open to all of you to comment by, if I may, mentioning some of the points that were raised by the board last week. And I think these are points that would, if we'd had time, be included on this particular presentation. But the first point to be borne in mind is that if we defer, as some suggested, the issue of the jurisdictional provision to be considered as part of phase 2 in conjunction with mandatory firm rotation and the other issues, we would effectively be extending the jurisdictional provision by some 4 to 5 years, given that phase 2 review is not due to start till 2023. The second thing is that the jurisdictional provision was provided as an exception for the provisions in the intervening period, and it was a signal to stakeholders, firms, professional accountancy organizations, standard setters, that at the end of the term, the expectation would be that the period would be 5 years. And if we reverse that signal now, that has the effect of opening up uncertainty about the direction of travel, which we think is an undesirable approach to take. Indeed, it's right to say that during the exposure of the original proposals, some questioned whether with such a lengthy lead time was required and whether the 5-year period of the exemption to 2023 should in fact be shorter than that. There is also a practical point. It's difficult to see why it is going to be easier to manage the situation if somebody is if the cooling off period is 3 years rather than 5 years. If you're appointing an audit partner, a new audit partner to a audit client for 3 years, is it really realistic to say that that person's going to be taken off that client after 3 years? Is that a desirable proposal? Or is it much more likely that once the person's come off, the new audit partner is going to have a reasonable period to get to know the client and audit the company's accounts for a longer period than 3 years. And from a management point of view, is that indeed a desirable approach? So from our perspective, whilst there were some concerns raised by the members of the board at some of the practical consequences, possibly in Europe, I think it's probably fair to say that the direction of travel recommended by the working group seemed to find support with the board. And no doubt Galen can express his views on whether that's a fair reflection of the discussion. And with that, Galen, if I may, I'll throw it open to questions.
I don't see anyone's hand raised quite yet. I'm sure we will, Richard. But yeah, if you had a rotation and you had a new partner, it would seem to me that that new partner would, after completion of the 3-year time off of the old partner, that the new partner isn't going to be rotated off again immediately anyway. He's going to continue at least for a couple more years. So what's the big deal?
I think that's the pragmatic, practical issue as Rich raised at the board meeting, and I see a few people wanting to argue with that.
Well, I don't see any hands raised yet, but my personal view, as I expressed at the board meeting, is that there should not be an extension. We should stick with what we originally said. Otherwise, it'll come back again and again and again. A need for an extension on maybe this and perhaps even other things. Hilda, you have your hand raised. Maybe you could express a different point of view. You're on mute. There you go.
Good. Sorry, it didn't quite work the first time I wanted to unmute. Also, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, maybe good night to all of you. And thank you very much, Richard, for taking us through the presentation. And well, maybe I will honor Galen's invitation to argue or to disagree. Obviously, Council Europe, we represent mainly a constitution in the European Union. So we have indeed some concerns to actually let the jurisdictional provision go now and to not wait until the outcome of phase 2 would be known. Richard argues, well, that would take 4 or 5 years. Obviously, you could say maybe phase 2 should have been immediately adjacent to phase 1. There are 2 ways to look at it, because we we hear all the arguments, most of them we follow, but we are concerned about 2 things in particular. First of all, you refer to the smaller firms, and we are not sure how, not only practical, but even feasible it is that, they would go to their regulator and ask for an exception of this, to have, for instance, 3 years instead of 5 years, if that is actually what in their regions or countries legislation is. They would need to go based on something that is decided by their PAO or their national standard setter, which might or might not be the regulator. So it looks a difficult ask, and especially as in Europe, there are concerns, and I think Gijssen already referred to it, related to concentration in the audit market and really trying to open up to smaller firms. So this seems to go counter to that wish. At least that's what we see in the European Union. And also, in general, if we disregard smaller firms and if we look at this in general, we fear that is one more reason why, we see within the European Union, our member bodies, the PAOs, to be more and more reluctant, if they are having the power to do this, to actually adopt the IESBA code. And that's not a evolution that we support. We would like them to seriously consider and to adopt the code, and also to be in line with their IFAC member compliance requirements. But you know, those type of things which have difference between what is in the code and what they have in their European or national legislation is hampering that. And it's a signal once more, as they tell us, that, well, maybe you know, we shouldn't take it all that serious, this code, because it doesn't make us want to adopt it. And we find this a concern, because there are a lot of good things in the IESBA code that very much we would like our professional accountancy organizations to actually adopt and to take on. But those type of things do prevent this a little bit from happening. So you might not be surprised about this view, but I think it's good to bring it on and to give the reasons why we are overall concerned with the way that the working group is taking. Thank you.
Richard, if I don't see any other hands raised at this point.
I mean, obviously, that's a counter.
Excuse me, you're breaking up there a little bit, Richard. Let's let that go. We'll come back to you in a second.
So,
Hussein has his hand raised now.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Richard, for your presentation. Actually, in our country, mandatory firm rotation is compulsory. Therefore, I think you should also consider measures as mandatory firm rotation. In the second phase, you should also consider mandatory firm rotation issues. And also, we observed that in our jurisdiction, 7 years, after 7 years period, there are 3 years cooling off period for firm. And also in our jurisdiction, audit firm also have to comply with ethics code. Therefore, partners are also subject to 5 years, 7 years to 5 years cooling, 7 years, after 7 years, 5 years cooling off period. Sometimes we observe some objection on these issues. Therefore, for this project, I think it's not for this project to address these issues. This jurisdictional exception from code should be considered, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions or points, Gail?
I don't see any others raised there, Richard. So,
well, if I could just respond to the last comments first. Mandatory firm rotation is definitely a matter that will be considered in phase 2. There's a commitment to do that already, and that will be looked at in the context of how jurisdictions around the world have applied mandatory firm rotation or not. And I note your comments about your regime, and we obviously are keen that as many countries as possible should move to a 7 and 5 year period, 6 on, 5 years off. Hilda, I sort of expected your arguments, because obviously they've been in the course of the consultation. We will look at them and review them, try to make sure that there are we don't generate difficulties that can't be addressed, and so I think it's a case of watch this space, but we will certainly look at that carefully. Galen, I have anything really else to add except to take people through the rest of the program for this project or this work task force.
Why don't you go ahead and do that quickly then?
Yep. Next slide, please, Jeff. So the steps are that we will present a final report to the IESBA board meeting in December, and then thereafter publish the decision. If that decision is that the jurisdiction provision will be allowed to lapse effectively, it will cease to have effect, then the way in which that will be handled is probably by a public announcement and a reference to the report that will have been received by the IESBA board. And that's the way forward as we see it. Obviously, if it's an extension or some other approach, then that's will obviously need to be developed, because it won't just simply be leaving the status quo as it is. It would require some positive action, and in that case there would be a different communication and process. Galen, I think the next steps, I think, is the last slide, isn't it, Jeff?
We're on that one right now, Richard. So.
Anything else, Jeff? Next slide.
No, that's it. This is
Yep.
the end of the presentation.
Okay, in that
Thanks,
case,
Richard.
Galen, that's the end of my presentation. Okay. And I hope I can take it from silence that, subject to Hilda's comments, there's general agreement with the comments that the working groups proposals.
Thank you. Stavros, anything on your part?
No, I think that Richard and the discussants expressed the various aspects. I don't have much to add. Thank you.
And Dr. Chen, anything there?
I do not have much comments, but would like to add that the proposals of the WG not to extend the jurisdictional provisions or allow for additional exemptions is a welcome outcome. It is important that cooling off requirements are not relaxed after the end of this transition period. That's just what I want to, add. Thank you.
Again, thank you, Richard, and we'll wait to see what happens.
Thanks, Galen.
All right. So our last presentation then will be on benchmarking, and I'd like to invite Lauran Friedrich, who is the working group chair, to go ahead with her presentation. If you want to bring up your slide deck on that, Laura.
Perfect. Thanks. Wonderful. Excellent. Thanks, Galen. Good day, everyone. I'm happy to be here to update you on phase 1 of the benchmarking initiative. And thanks to Astu, who is going to be controlling slides for us today. So whoops, have we lost the slides?
Bear with me.
No worries. So I've also asked Richard Fleck, who you obviously just heard from, to join me in presenting our update today for 2 reasons. One is that Richard has been heavily involved with the work that's being done in drafting the detailed work with Sylvia Schramko, our key staff person on the project, and also obviously because of his wealth of experience as the NAS task force chair. So he's going to be presenting with me. There we go. Okay. As to the slides are a bit small, is that what we've got to work with at the moment, or it looks like it's not in the full presentation mode?
Yeah, let me reshare again. Sorry, Laura.
Yeah, no worries, no worries.
Sorry, guys, I'm having issues on my end. Could Sylvia or Dana share theirs?
There we go.
Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, Astu. Thanks, Diana. It's always good to have a plan B. All right, then. So for the session today, first off, I'll call your attention to the report back from the March session. The report back is in our agenda paper. I'm not going to cover it off point by point, but I will speak to it a bit as I go through the presentation. And then next, I'll fill you in on some of the highlights from the discussion at the IESBA meeting last week. And then Richard and I will go through the highlights of the comparison work that's been done to date at a very high level. I'll cover the opening pieces, and then Richard will talk specifically about our work and observations with respect to non-assurance services. And we're looking for your thoughts on our direction of observations and also on current plans regarding outputs. And if we can go to the next slide, please. Thanks. So just as a reminder, or for anyone that's still getting up to speed on this project, the first phase of the benchmarking work is comparing the independence standards in the code that are applicable to PIEs with the independence requirements of the US Securities and Exchange Commission and the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board, so PCAOB. So that means that we're focused on part 4A of the code, but of course, we'll bring in parts 1 and parts 3 as needed based on the code's building blocks approach. So with respect to the US independence requirements, I want to emphasize that we're using an incremental approach here, meaning that we're focusing our comparison work on the SEC requirements as the base and only referring to the PCAOB requirements where they are more restrictive than the SEC rules. So to do that, we've needed to determine where, in fact, the PCAOB rules go beyond the SEC rules. And we're doing that with respect to the specific elements that are being compared as part of the benchmarking. But that's not to say that we're going to identify every instance where the PCAOB and the SEC rules differ. Our work obviously is very much focused on the areas that we're highlighting for comparison. So we don't want readers to infer that our document can in fact be used, more broadly to compare the SEC and the PCAOB requirements. It will not be suitable for that. In response to a couple of comments and questions that we've received in the past, we're using a variety of the published materials to support our interpretations, including, for example, the SEC or the PCAOB's staff prepared documents where those are relevant to what we're doing. Again, we're not doing a full review of all of the staff materials that are published by either of those organizations, but we are using them for guidance wherever it's helpful for us to do so. And the next slide, please. Thanks. So I just want to look back at some of the input that we've received along the way and how that has helped guide us as we've continued on in our work. When we started the project, we were intending to do a fairly comprehensive paragraph by paragraph type of comparison, but it quickly became apparent that that approach was going to lead us to produce a very long and complicated report, and that more importantly, we'd then be spending some of our time at least analyzing issues that were not particularly relevant to stakeholders. So after the March CAG and board meetings, we adjusted our approach to focus only on the topics that are of greatest interest to stakeholders, rather than trying to cover off all of them. And I'll review those for you in just a minute. We also heard cautions that we need to be careful to ensure that we're not seen to be rulemaking outside of the code or offering interpretive guidance. We're very mindful of the need for careful wording in this regard, and that we don't go beyond the mandate of the initiative. And finally, there was some initial question about the objectives for the initiative, including from this group. And we've clarified that the main objective is to compare the two sets of standards and determine where they're aligned and where there are substantive differences. And the project is also planning to help inform the IESBA as to whether there are specific areas that it should evaluate and, if appropriate, address as part of its future strategy and work plan. And the next slide, please. Thank you. So I mentioned that we had narrowed our approach to focus on the areas that we believe to be of greatest interest to stakeholders. Many of these topics are ones that have historically been, high stakes, so to speak. And the list of focus areas is in the agenda paper, and we'll continue to refine this list based on targeted discussions with stakeholders that we'll be doing in Q4. And we welcome any thoughts also that you might have at any point. If you think that we've missed an important area, please do let us know. And the next slide. So here is the list of topic areas that we're planning to include in the comparison overall. The most recent addition to the list was Gibson Hospitality, based on feedback received at the June board meeting from Galen, if I'm not mistaken. And in agenda item F1 for you, we've provided you with the current draft of the comparison work that we've done to date. And that covers off the top 3 areas shown here on the slide, those being the overarching principles, the key definitions, and of course, the permissibility of NAS to audit clients. And we've also included a general reference to the NOCLAR provisions as part of that discussion of the overarching principles. And within that context, we'll also be able to address another suggestion that was received at the June board meeting to try to be responsive to the importance that's being placed globally on combating corruption and the recognition that the code's provisions in this area are part of the global efforts in that regard. So the 3 focus areas in the top row here, they were chosen as the starting point for reasons that are likely fairly obvious. The overarching principles and the key definitions set the overall context for the work and apply to all of the more specific topic areas that follow. And NAS was chosen as the first set of specific requirements to compare because of its importance to stakeholders. So these first 3 sections, they also form, I think, the greatest bulk of the work. And the other sections, they're in the process of being drafted and they will be available in due course. On the next slide, please. Thank you. So one of the key points that's become even more evident the further into the work that we go is that as much as both the code and the SEC and PCAOB requirements, they're broadly similar in objectives, but there are some important differences in context and approach that make it really impossible to directly compare both sets of requirements on an apples to apples kind of basis. The first is the scope. So the code applies to all PAs, of course, and to services provided to any client, whether it's a PI or not. The SEC rules, on the other hand, apply only to auditors of issuers and certain other entities. And although our focus in the project here is only on the independence requirements for PIs, in the code, obviously, as well as the relevant building block pieces that join in on that, it does make it a bit more challenging to evaluate and present one-to-one discussions because of the fuller scope of the code in terms of the way that it's written overall. More importantly, though, from the perspective of our analysis work, there's also the fundamental difference that the code is written for a global audience, but the IESBA doesn't have direct jurisdiction and so relies on national laws and regulations for implementation. And by contrast, obviously, the SEC and PCAOB requirements are developed for a specific application in the US context where there is full jurisdiction in that regard. And the next slide, please. So I just want to reiterate a few points here and just to make sure that we're setting expectations appropriately. The first is, as I mentioned a minute ago, our comparison work is not going to try to figure out, who the winner is, so to speak. There's merits to both approaches in different contexts. And it's not the goal to try to say which one is overall, better in any way. Secondly, our work focuses on the issues that are important to readers. We're not singling out nitty-gritty details that have no practical implications. So in other words, we're aiming to limit our discussion to substantive issues and focus on whether the code's provisions and the SEC rules address the same issues and achieve the same substantive outcomes. We're reporting back on the similarities and differences at that level, again, noting that a direct one-to-one is often not possible from a comparison point of view, given the different contexts and the different approaches of the 2 sets of requirements. And lastly, a reminder that the final outputs will be staff documents based on the various input that's been received. And the next slide, please. Okay, so next I want to talk a bit about the proposed output from the initiative. Although our methodology for the project has shifted a little bit over the course of our work, we're still very much aware that the information we produce needs to hit different levels of granularity for different audiences or different purposes. So we've been spending our time on the detailed analysis so far, and the output of that work is what's been circulated to you as paper F1. We've been trying to strike the right level of detail here without making it overwhelming for readers. The information is generally laid out based on the code's structure, discussing the code and then the corresponding SEC requirements, as well as then the PCAOB requirements in cases where those PCAOB requirements go beyond what the SEC specifies in its rules. And we think that this ordering makes it easier to follow and to find your way around the document. And within the analysis, we've tried to include sufficient explanation of any of the interpretations that we've made and the rationale for our comments and our observations. And then we've summarized what we believe to be the key differences and similarities in commentary paragraphs that sort of wrap up each section of the discussion. And if we can move on then, please. So that's the detailed analysis, but we recognize that not all readers are going to be interested in that level of granularity. Some stakeholders will instead, or in addition, be looking for a really high level overview that summarizes our observations and our conclusions. And this is also likely to be the level that the board is going to be most interested, the IESBA is going to be more interested in terms of future considerations, given that the IESBA is going to be most interested in some of those big picture lessons learned from the exercise, rather than the finer, comparative points between the two regimes. So obviously the summary information needs to be consistent with and fully supported by the detailed work, but it also needs to be able to stand alone as a separate deliverable for those who are only interested in those higher level outcomes. So then as far as the levels go, both of them are essential for their purposes, and having both will give us the flexibility as to how each of the two documents, how they're positioned, how they're presented, how they're promoted based on stakeholder needs. And the specifics around these decisions will be made once the deliverables themselves have been fully drafted. And the next slide. So we discussed all of this at the IESBA meeting last week, and there was support for a summary level of information in one format or another. There were some suggestions as to format options that we might want to try or consider. The board agreed that it's going to be important to focus on the targeted audience or audiences and make sure that the information meets their needs by prioritizing, again, those areas of interest as we've been trying to achieve with those focus areas. We did hear a suggestion to perhaps publish the high-level comparison of the overarching approaches separate from the detailed discussion, perhaps based on provisions relevant to individuals versus relevant to firms. We'll certainly consider that suggestion, but we also need to be careful that we don't end up with too many versions of the same information to keep track of, particularly where there's overlapping information that's needed in each of, in all pieces of whatever we would be producing for full context there. So we do, though, want to make sure that the output has a very clear index to make sure that relevant sections can be linked to very quickly by individuals to get to the level of detail that they want for a specific issue very easily. We were also asked whether the outputs of the project will explicitly be highlighting areas for the IESBA to consider going forward, those lessons learned, so to speak. To answer that, we won't be putting those observations directly in the published outputs that are meant for, for people who are interested in reading the outputs of the benchmarking overall. Those observations for the IESBA, they could, though, be summarized in a separate manner in some form to keep those main outputs for broader use by all stakeholders. And lastly, there was a discussion about the wording to be used in the commentary paragraphs with respect to a specific requirement being more or less stringent than another, or being broader in scope and so on. Here, we're trying to be really objective and factual in our commentary. We also need to make sure that the comments that we're making are actually meaningful for readers as well. So we appreciate the need for choosing our words very carefully, and we will continue to try and do so. We'll have more discussions around, what exactly the wording will be best in those particular commentary paragraphs and so on. Okay, on the next slide then. Just looking at the time, perhaps I'll continue on, and then we'll pause for questions when I finish my section of the presentation, and then when Richard has gone through his as well, rather than breaking it up a little bit too much, if we're okay with that. So if we can carry on, then that would be great. Thank you. So then let me move next to give you an overview of the high-level outcomes of our analysis to date with respect to the three areas that are presented there in agenda item F1. So as I mentioned, I'll talk about the first two, and then I'll hand it off to Richard to go through the NAS piece. And let me just stress here that our observations and conclusions at this stage are still preliminary, and they're very much subject to change as we continue to work our way through, as we collect more information, as we hear more input and feedback from others. So with that in mind, we're not going to be looking for detailed discussions today on the specifics of the interpretations or conclusions, given that they are still very much draft. But if you do have any comments on the specifics, if you see something that really catches your attention, that you really think that we might be missing the mark on or something like that, then we are actively seeking those offline at any time by way of email to Sylvia, and her email address is in the presentation, I know, and I know it's available to you as well, probably fairly easily. All right, on the next slide then. Thanks. So in the first section of the analysis that's in that paper F1, we've looked at the code's approach using the fundamental principles and the conceptual framework. And we've similarly laid out the approach that's taken under the SEC and the PCAOB frameworks. And we've noted that the code and the US requirements, they're both a hybrid in terms of the types of systems, so to speak, with specific rules and requirements that support a higher level, a set of higher level principles or objectives. So both systems then have similar overarching objectives or principles that obviously aim to achieve appropriate auditor independence. But there are some differences in how independence is assessed and how the objectives and principles are applied, often related, again, to those differences in context and approach. The next slide, please. So when we look at how the big picture principles or objectives compare, we see strong alignment in many cases, even though there's not necessarily a one-to-one mirroring. So for example, both sets of standards look at self-interest and conflicts of interest as having obvious negative implications for auditor independence. Similarly, both clearly deal with the concept of not auditing one's own work. Both are interested in ensuring that auditors don't assume management responsibilities and that auditors don't end up in positions where advocacy on the client's behalf impairs objectivity and independence. But the last two concepts here on the right-hand side, so management responsibility and advocacy, those two, although yes, there are similarities, we've really identified that there's different approaches being taken here within the code versus the SEC context. So I'll talk about the management responsibility piece in just a second here, and I'll clarify that. And then I'll let Richard speak to the observations that we've had on advocacy as part of his discussion on NAS. And the next slide. So as we've said previously, we see a great deal of similarity in terms of overall objectives and principles, but there's a key difference in the frameworks in terms of the processes that are prescribed for determining whether a relationship or a service is prohibited. The code, on the one hand, focuses on the possibility that a service or relationship might give rise to a threat, and then on whether that potential threat is at or can be reduced to an acceptable level. And on that basis, the service or the relationship is prohibited if the threats can't be reduced to an acceptable level by way of safeguards. And then further in the PI context, which is of course the context for our project, prohibitions result under the NAS provisions if the service or relationship might result in a self-review threat. So by contrast, the SEC rules simply, they prohibit services or relationships that would lead to a breach of their overarching principles. So as a result, under the SEC framework, a firm's assessment focuses on whether the service or relationship would threaten compliance with any of those overarching principles, rather on the level of threat of a breach of those principles. And because safeguards aren't permitted under the SEC rules, the outcomes then are somewhat more clear-cut. And what this means is that an all-encompassing, comparative evaluation isn't possible, again, because so much depends on the specific circumstances. Okay, if we can move on. Thank you. So now I want to talk about an area that's occupied a good deal of our working group's discussions, and that is the different approaches taken by the code and the SEC rules with respect to management responsibility. So in terms of the way the code deals with it, the code prohibits assuming a management responsibility by firms, prohibits assuming a management responsibility for an audit client. The prohibition applies to all aspects of the relationship between the firm and the client. Under the SEC rules, there's similarities and differences in terms of the way this is addressed. So at the highest level, there's a distinction between the two approaches in that the IESBA code focuses on taking responsibility for the performance of certain activities, whereas in the SEC rules, the focus is really on performing certain activities. So a slight difference there, though, that does become meaningful when we kind of consider the perspective that's being taken. Also, the SEC rules, they include a general prohibition against acting as management, but they also prohibit acting as an employee of the audit client. Specifically, the SEC's rules on management functions is on the slide for you here. It prohibits an auditor from acting temporarily or permanently as a director, officer, or monitoring function for the audit client. In contrast, Section 525 of the code allows for personnel to be loaned to an audit client for a short period of time if certain conditions are met. So we see a difference there, and we've explained this in the detailed work, but I'll note that we've heard feedback that the full distinction between the two approaches is not yet coming across clearly in the report. So we'll be revisiting that specifically. Okay, so that's the overview of our analysis of the overarching approaches of the code and the SEC rules. Again, these are contained in agenda item F1. And I'll just mention that there's two components within this part of the detailed work that we still have to complete yet. Those are with respect to NOCLAR and the section on mutual or conflicting interests with the audit client. Okay, if we can move on one then. Okay, so I'll move on to the definitions. With respect to definitions, it's obviously important for us to understand how the terms are being used in the different standards in order to then understand the respective provisions. But we also need to keep in mind that it's not that important whether the two sets of standards define things in the same way. What matters is how the provisions themselves are written with reference to those definitions. So in other words, it wouldn't be valid for us to make conclusions on how the requirements or the rules compare just by comparing the definitions. We need the full context to be able to make those comparisons. So what our analysis of the definition looks to do then is to explain how the terms are used in each set of requirements and primarily look at the scope that they set to provide background for our discussion of the provisions that then call on those definitions. And there are 4 definitions that we found to be worthy of discussion. They're shown here. I'll just mention a few key points on these. So first off, both the code and the SEC rules include either related entities or affiliates in their definitions of the audit client. So related entities in the code, affiliates in the SEC rules. So then we've needed to also compare the definitions of related entities with the definitions of affiliates under the affiliates under the SEC rules. To see whether the scopes of those are they the same? And we've seen that there are a few differences, and we've set them out in the report where the SEC definitions in this respect are somewhat broader. With respect to firms and network firms as defined in the code is more specific here, but we've also looked at how the SEC considers associated entities. And here, when we look sort of at the overall, the objectives are largely the same, namely to address the position of those firms that are required to be independent of the audit client. And then with respect to the definitions of audit team and either key audit partner or just audit partner, these require careful consideration, again, of the wording of the provisions to see who is scoped in by way of definition and who might be specified additionally in the provisions themselves. But in general, we're not aware of instances where the differences in the way that these particular definitions are used would lead to any substantive differences in application. Okay, if I can have the next slide, please. So at this point, actually, if we back up one, I'll stop and take some questions here before I pass it on to Richard, if that would be perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So let me ask one question. On this reporting that you're talking about, and 2 levels of reports, I guess, is what you're looking at, a sort of an executive summary and then a detailed, more complete report. Are both of these intended to be for external or internal use, or is there any distinction on that?
Yeah, thanks, Galen. So we're recognizing that depending on the audience, depending on the stakeholder, they might only want that higher level summary, in which case that would be the one they would go to. They might, in fact, very much need and want the detail. So that was the reason for our sort of gut sense is that they would be 2 separate documents so that they would not necessarily need to be used by the same individual. Someone could just pick up the summary. Are they intended to both be public? In terms of the exact sort of what we do with them, how they're promoted, how they're published, and so on, we're still sort of looking at what the possibilities might be. Gut sense, I would think, is that, yes, I mean, in one way or another, they are board papers, so they will be public documents. But in terms of exactly how they might end up looking for publication purposes and so on, we still have, you know, some flexibility around making sure that they're fit for purpose for the audience who is in fact looking at them. So I won't say that we've, you know, come to a conclusive decision as to exactly what each of those documents will look like. But I think our gut sense at this point is that they are likely to be two documents that then would allow linkage, for example, from the summary into the more detailed document for those who are looking for it, but that the summary would stand alone on its own. Does that help, Galen?
Yeah, thank you. So I don't see any hands. Was there any particular, or was there any particular areas that you were looking for feedback from the CAG? I do see a hand now, so we'll hold off on that question. Hilda would like to comment.
Yes, thank you, Galen. And I would like to start off by saying, well, thank you very much, and well done until now, because over time at Accounts Europe, we have actually done two comparisons between the then IESBA Code of Ethics and the European Union Ethical and Independence requirements. And, you know, we found this a complex, long, time-consuming and tedious exercise. So I would say we feel for you. What we also found was that actually, once we had done our work, we actually shared it with the staff at the IESBA board. And I can tell you that they found a lot of matters that we hadn't quite understood well or presented incorrectly. So I don't know if you are sharing whatever the outcome of your work is with the SEC staff, but we found that that was quite useful to, you know, sharpen our work. What we also found because of that, in part, is that the devil is really in the detail. And, you know, you can say, okay, I'm doing this and I want to have some summary highlights of that is very significantly different. That is more or less the same. Before you could get to that conclusion or summary, a lot of detailed work had to be done to really make sure that you had come to the right conclusion. And also we found if you wanted to actually take any action on what the work was that you have done, you really had to go into quite a level of detail. So you're wondering about the level of granularity, but it's actually not that straightforward to respond to that, because it really depends what the use is of what you will do with the outcome of the exercise. So for the moment, we would say, well, you know, keep on hanging in there. But once you really decide, okay, that's what I need to look at further, because I might want to take some action on this. We found that you had to actually go all the way and look almost paragraph per paragraph and try to compare in that way before you could actually come to a meaningful, you know, comparison and conclusion. So I would say good luck with that.
Thank you, Hilda. Jim Dalkin, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, just a quick comment that I very much appreciate this effort. And I think it's really good in a sense of convergence, or at least identifying and knowing where there are differences, because to the extent we can be similar across the world, that is very helpful for everyone.
Thank you, Jim. Would you like, or Laura, would you like to come back on those comments? I don't see anybody else's hands raised, but I'm going to have something else in a second.
Perfect. Yeah, will do. Thanks. Yeah, Jim, thanks so much for that observation. Absolutely appreciate that. Hilda, so in terms of, thanks first for the empathy. Yes, I know you've mentioned before the work that's been done previously and that you understand the complexity of some of the challenges and so on. So thank you again. You're right, absolutely. There are situations where the level of detail that we're looking at, we do need to go and get down right into the paragraph by paragraph. Where the real challenge then comes is in terms of how much do we put in the report to get to the point as quickly as we can without it becoming overwhelming and ending up, you know, having the the reader effectively walk through every step of those details that we've gone through. So we are looking for the balance there. And I absolutely appreciate that there's no single answer in terms of what level of detail is appropriate. It does very much depend, and we're finding that as we go through. So it is something that you will see differences in the level of detail, again, depending on the specifics and the granularity that we need to get to in the first place to be able to even come up with the commentary that we're presenting. In terms of your mention in terms of, is this something that, would it be beneficial to float this to the SEC or PCAOB staff? They are aware of the project, and we will welcome any insight that they offer, particularly in terms of, kind of the fact checking. Absolutely.
Laura, I don't see any other hands. Just an observation more than anything. And I'm sure that the working group is already aware of this. I mean, the difference, a very fundamental difference, of course, is the SEC, PCAOB is involved with enforcement. They're regulators, whereas the IESBA is not. And that forms, I think, a very significant difference with respect to our approach, being with the conceptual framework and the emphasis on safeguards, whereas the SEC is really, I mean, part of their enforcement is self-reporting and whistleblowing, and they have a very extensive consultation approach to dealing with breaches and exceptions as they come forth, sort of where people are able to resolve differences one-on-one on a confidential basis up front. And I think that needs to be brought out in the report, that sort of basic difference between the two bodies. And I think that would be helpful to the readers. I see another hand up before we move along. Wei Meng, go ahead, Wei.
Oh, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks a lot for the work has been done. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I would like to echo a little bit about what Galen commented. It's a challenging project, as it is pointed out by Laura, as it was mentioning in the draft and also in the presentation. The code and the SEC rules have different jurisdictional bases and followed quite different conceptual approaches. PIs and issuers subject to the regulation of SEC are different entities, although there are some overlaps. And some jurisdictions do not have the concept of PIs. So it is important to highlight this as the beginning of the report and keep that in mind when making the comparison. That's all. Thank you.
Laura, I see no other hands. Did you want to follow up with any of that, or do we hand off to Richard at this point?
At this point, I'll just say, yeah, thank you so much. Yes, absolutely. It's a key difference. We have tried to make sure that we've highlighted that in the report. And we're, obviously we're open to feedback if there's something else that should be brought in there in terms of the specifics of the differences between the jurisdictional approaches. Please do share that with us if you think that we've missed spelling out something in that regard or anything else in the paper. Thank you so much. Yes, I will hand off to Richard then to carry on with the NAS provisions. Thanks.
Thank you, Laura. And Galen, just to follow up on your point, and you'll know this because I raised it at the board meeting, one of the challenges with this project is that very much a lot depends on what the role of the body concerned may be. You've drawn out the distinction between enforcement and standard setting to promote quality, and that influences greatly, I think, whether something is thought to be better, stricter, broader, whatever other words you want to use. And that's one of the reasons we need to think carefully about how we articulate the differences, the merits of the differences or the effect of the differences in the eventual summary document. But let me repeat what Laura said at the beginning, which is that the objective is ultimately to find and identify areas where there are conceptual or substantive differences in approach, so that those are that guide the IESBA as it looks at its future work program, and not really to get hung up about narrow differences, differences that are of narrow effect because they have addressed an issue that blew up in a particular jurisdiction or whatever it may be. So with that background, let me turn to non-assurance services. The most important point to make is that both frameworks focus on looking at additional services provided to audit clients and adopting an approach that ensures or tries to ensure that the provision of those services do not compromise auditor independence. And both frameworks actually go about that in substantially the same way. They're founded on strong overarching principles, whether it's the conceptual framework and the fundamental principles, or whether it's the overarching principles that the SEC establishes. And that is that foundation is then complemented by a list or provisions addressing specific services. There's one material difference which I'll draw out as a generic difference, and that is that the section in the code applies to the provision of non-assurance services, and other assurance services are governed by the fundamental principles of the conceptual framework, whereas the SEC looks at all other services provided to audit clients, irrespective of whether they're assurance or non-assurance or non-audit services. That said, I think that's a difference in the end, I think that's not a substantive difference, but it is a distinction in the way in which the provisions are framed. Next slide, please. As I've said, the frameworks are those services that are not expressly prohibited may only be provided if the relevant overarching principles or requirements are complied with, and the little table at the bottom makes that clear. The code also does one other thing, which of course is necessary because it isn't focused on one jurisdiction, and that is it requires a firm to consider the provisions in national laws and regulations, and to comply with the code if the code is stricter. Now, obviously that doesn't apply in the US because the SEC rules have effectively, they are the national laws and regulations for the purposes of the US. So what this is doing is dealing with the situation that around the globe, there are jurisdictions with all sorts of different provisions. And what we're saying is the code applies. If you purport to comply with the code, then you comply with the code irrespective of national laws and jurisdictions if the code is stricter. Next slide, please. This slide looks at what I suppose you would describe as the primary threats. On the top left, it discusses the position in relation to the self-review threat, which is without doubt the one that generates the most concern and focus. And there is a difference in that there's a difference in that only in that the way in which they go about it. They both take the same approach in that they prohibit the provision of a service that gives rise to a self-review threat. In the case of the code, the threshold for the prohibition is where the self-review threat might exist. And for the SEC rule, the threshold is when the self-review threat would exist. But together, they both apply and seek to achieve the same thing, which is to prohibit the provision of a service which compromises the independence of the firm through the existence of a self-review threat. There are other services that give rise to other threats, and in some instances, it appears that there is a difference in their application. The one that I wanted to focus on for the purpose of today is the advocacy threat, where it's clear that there is a distinction, a difference of approach. And I hope I won't be corrected, perhaps I should say, by some members of the CAG, but the distinction, and we're still working on this, so this is not a concluded position, but the advocacy threat as as understood and as applied by the code, focuses on where you are acting as an advocate for a client in a particular situation, whether it's in a court case, whether it's in promoting shares, and so forth. It appears to us, as we currently understand the position, that the advocacy threat under the SEC framework is more along the lines of where a firm can be considered to be aligning itself with the interests of the firm. And the sort of area which highlights the difference is if you have a situation where an accounting firm has a legal practice arm, and where for an audit client there is a request to prepare a power of attorney or something equivalent to enable somebody to go and sign a document overseas or whatever it happens to be. And as we understand it at the present, that would fall foul of the SEC view of advocacy, because you would be aligning yourself with the activities and interests of the audit client. We need to understand that further, and we will be working on that further, but that's an example of an area where it seems to us that there is a distinction, a difference. The long box at the bottom has been touched on by Laura. It's the distinction between assuming management responsibility by virtue of taking the decisions and so forth, and which is the code approach, and acting as management or an employee in the manner that Laura described earlier, which is more along the lines of actually performing the functions of management or employee. If we go to the next slide, please, we can look at the services expressly prohibited. I think, yes. This is a summary, very high level summary of the different approaches to specific services. The bolder or the darker colored boxes indicate where there's a difference in the approach. The difference in administrative services arises from the fact that the prohibition on acting as an employee means that there are no permitted administrative services under the SEC PCAOB rules. The box related to tax services is highlighting the fact that there are SEC PCAOB rules focusing on the provision of services to individuals in a financial reporting oversight role. That doesn't feature in the code at present, and I think it's an area which many people would say is significant. There is a difference in approach to litigation support and expert services unrelated to the audit, which is along the lines, arises out of the advocacy approach, as does the legal services, and as does the corporate finance services approach. We're working our way through these at the present time, but I think it's fair to say that some of these are, there are areas of difference that depend on the detail, but looking at it from the conceptual point of view, we are driven back to focusing on the issue of management responsibility stroke acting as management or employees, the difference in approach taken by the two frameworks there, and the difference in approach taken to advocacy or doing work for clients that has an alignment, in my terms, an alignment effect. And those, I think what that comment does more than anything else is to highlight what we're trying to draw out through this process, which is where there is a difference of approach rather than where the actual drafting of the provisions gives rise to differences in application. And that's a fundamentally different, that's the difference we're trying to distinguish, and where we're trying to focus on the substantive differences. Next slide, please. Any questions? Over to all of you. Thank you.
Here's your opportunity.
No hands. Happy to stop, Galen.
No hands yet there, Richard. I do see one now. Conchita, I can always depend on Conchita to come forward. Conchita, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you. While I was listening to Laura and Richard, I was made to go back to my basic question when this subject was taken up in the last meeting. And I said, I recall asking, what are the objectives of this initiative? Okay, now, looking at things now, and you presented revised objectives. May I ask, knowing the comments that the three being compared, if comparison is the right word, they are not of the same type of entity. Two are actually enforcers, the other one is a standard setter. And the standard setter is more of international reach, and it is principles based and not rules based. So having said that, and I don't know whether it's a fair question to ask, but anchoring on my initial question before on the objectives, may I ask, based on what you know now, do you see a number of substantive findings that you may arrive at, and how this would impact on the next steps? Thank you.
Again, can I take that straight away?
Sure. Sure.
Laura, if you're happy for me to do so. Conchita, I think this is, this is obviously in some ways the fundamental challenge that we're facing in trying to do this, which is to draw out things that are meaningful for further consideration and so forth. I think I wouldn't want to, for 1 second, to imply that it's clear that the IESBA will have to address X issue or Y issue. There will be, but if I just take, for example, the difference of approach to management responsibility and acting as management, I think that it's quite possible that somebody might say, well, IESBA needs to look at whether its approach, which is in providing a service, are you assuming management responsibility because the management doesn't have the the knowledge, experience to make a judgment. So whatever the firm says will be what happens. Is that the only issue, or should the IESBA code also be dealing with, as the SEC does, what happens if you are actually seconded and so forth? And are we happy with provisions which involve actually acting as management or an employee? I would add that the SEC code doesn't deal with the assumption of responsibility position in the same way as the IESBA code. So both frameworks might have something to look at as a result of this benchmarking exercise. And I think certainly from my perspective, our objective is to draw out the issues at that level, which require the board, in the case of IESBA, to take a view on whether there is something that needs to be looked at, explored, and possibly a result in revisions to the code, as opposed to, and I don't think that issue is necessarily affected by whether you are a standard setter or an enforcement body. That what one's effectively highlighting, if I'm right in my assumptions, is two different things which are not actually in either, where neither framework deals with both of them. Does that help you, Conchita?
You're on mute there, Conchita.
I hesitate to debate or argue. I am just surfacing my thoughts because I don't think there is enough for me to ponder on to say I agree with what you said. Thank you.
Richard, I see no other comments coming forth from the CAG at this point. If you wanted to go forward, or
Laura, do you want to do the rest, or shall I finish it off?
Yeah, no, it's okay. I can pick it up from here. Thanks so much, Richard. Excellent. If there's any questions at the end, obviously, you will obviously be involved in any questions at the final period as well. So just quickly in terms of our next steps, the last thing we wanted to touch on here. So we'll be hearing from the NSS in October, and we're also still working out some plans to touch base over the next couple of months with a few specific stakeholders in order to make sure that we've identified the, kind of those key topic areas of greatest relevance to them, that we've got that list nailed down appropriately. At the December board meeting, we'll be providing a further update on the analysis work and how we're anticipating at that point how we would be positioning the different levels of information, things like specifically what the outputs will look like at that point based on our best judgment then. And we're still expecting to then publish those final deliverables in Q1 of next year. All right, we do have one final opportunity for questions at the end, if there are any.
Stavros, would you like to weigh in?
Yes, yes, Gail, and I'll be happy to if there are no other questions. Just a few remarks. I think that Laura and Richard covered everything. I would simply like to share my personal view on this, because I've been a supporter of this for quite some time. And it seems to me that the IESBA and the work done so far seeks, through this exercise of comparisons and differences and similarities, seeks, I think, to give the global standard setter a certain amount of comfort that we are on comparable ground. And to me, that is very important. And to me, that is why also it would make sense to, once this work is completed, to make benchmarking exercises with other major jurisdictions. The second is that, of course, IESBA is now preparing for its new strategy and work plan. I would like to repeat this to the CAG. I've said it before. And clearly, if there are possible conceptual gaps, such as some examples that we've heard Richard and Laura mentioning, they could very well feed into our future planning as issues for IESBA to look at or to further develop. And finally, this issue of enforcement that several people mentioned is really very important to raise awareness of the difference between a global standard setter and the national standard setters, because that serves in setting expectations. What do we expect? We cannot expect of a global standard setter the kind of granularity and the kind of force that an enforcing regulator has. And of course, enforcement of the IESBA code is not done by IESBA, it's mediated by national standard setters and large audit firms in the case of transnational audits. So we don't have direct enforcement. And this has to do, I find, in my outreach and in my contacts, it has to do with how we set expectations for the global standard setter. So these are, to my mind, the very useful aspects that we're seeking to achieve, and the very useful objectives that we're seeking to achieve through this, in my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Stavros. And our PIOB observer, Dr. Chen, would like to comment.
Thank you, Chairman. I just want to add that the revised objective to clarify that the aim is to promote awareness and adoption of the code, as well as its intention of avoiding including conclusions in the final report was a welcome approach and helpful to address concerns raised by various parties, including the PIOB. However, the statement in paragraph 5 of the report said to state whether the provisions assessed achieve the same substantive outcomes, and commentaries such as the one in paragraph 32, with statements about which provisions are stricter and not aligned with the objective of avoiding conclusions and may have unintended consequences. Further, given that the objective is also to identify gaps in the code requirements that could inform future strategy and work plan, the IESBA should remain cautious not to create a perception that the code will be steered towards any particular jurisdiction. Additionally, so far I have completed observations on the whole 3 sessions of the IESBA CAG meeting that I was impressed by the effective operation of the meeting. It is my first time observing the SSB events since joining the PIOB. From that, I learned a lot surrounding the standard settings, though I have ever been involved in IFAC activities as IFAC board members for 3 terms when the SSB are parts of the IFAC family. Based on my experiences with the observations on the 3 sessions, I do understand that all those projects are progressing on the right track, and the achievement so far is applaudable. Finally, I want to express our appreciations, knowing and working together with you all. Best wishes. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. Well, this brings us to the end of the conclusion of our 3-day meeting. I do have some other comments here that I need to make at the end, but before I do that, I'd like to say really thank you to the staff for all the preparation of materials, the presenters, and the participation of representatives and observers in the process of this 3-day meeting. I can tell you that the comments and the input from the CAG is sincerely considered by the board at their meetings, and I think it's an important part of due process. Let me speak to the upcoming meetings for 2022 that we have on the schedule right now, and that you might want to mark and calendar for yourselves. So for the first quarter of 2022, March 7th through the 9th will be the CAG meetings, beginning with the ethics meeting on March 7th, and then followed by a joint meeting of the CAG and the IAASB, and then the IAASB will be meeting on March 9th. I think those are the beginning of the week, but I'm not sure. And then quarter 3, which is usually in September, we will have our meeting starting on a Tuesday following a U.S. public holiday, again for the leading with the ethics CAG meeting on the 6th of September, followed by our joint meeting, and then the IAASB CAG meeting on the 7th, and the September 8th, there will be an IAASB CAG meeting. And Jeff, I think it's fair to say, or maybe Ken, it's undetermined whether it'll be a virtual meeting at this point, or whether it'll be in New York, or will it be a hybrid? Maybe you could say.
At this stage, it's based on face-to-face meeting, but of course we can't confirm that until closer to the date. Also, we'll be sending out a joint email. So if you didn't get the dates just now, you receive an email from both CAGs sometime this week.
Okay, so again, though, to repeat, March 7th through the 9th, for the first quarter, and then the third quarter will be September 6th through September 8th. Thank you, Jeff. And then most importantly, just a few words about this meeting. It's Stavros's last meeting with the CAG. And we're going to see his term expire in December, and I wanted to say a few things about that. Stavros was appointed IESBA chair beginning in January of 2015. Just some of his background, very high level, of course, is that he is an emeritus professor of financial economics at the University of Athens. He has a celebrated career both in the US and in Europe, not only as an academic, but also as a regulator in Europe. And notably, he was also the first PIOB chair. Stavros has always been very open to the views of stakeholders such as us on the CAG, and he has made sure that the board focuses on the key issues that are brought to him by the CAG, and I sincerely appreciate that. Obviously his impact and influence over the work of the IESBA can be felt across the board and across the globe. And under his leadership, the board has successfully completed some of the most significant projects that are reflected in the code, including restructuring of the code, long association, no CLAR, safeguards and updating of the conceptual framework, non-assurance services and fees, not to mention the significant projects that are in process right now. From a personal standpoint, having been the CAG chair for some time now, it's been very disappointing that we've had the pandemic and I haven't been able to spend the time in person with Stavros that usually goes on between chair of the board and the CAG chair. But I really appreciate all the deep contributions that Stavros, you have made over the years, and wondered if you might want to say a few words to the CAG before we end this meeting.
Well, Galen, I'm moved by your words, and since they come without warning, I have not prepared a speech. I was hoping that I would be able to maybe come at another CAG meeting even after my time, or certainly write a letter to all the CAG members. But let me say a few words. First of all, many thanks for your very good and very kind words. In some cases, I think you exaggerated, but that's all right. Today, I want to say that the CAG, the present members and past members, the present chair and the past chair have been, to me, extremely valuable fellow travelers in my journey in IESBA. And many of you I consider as my good friends and good collaborators. I will not mention each one, but you know that, and you have my heartfelt thanks and warmest feelings of appreciation about your contributions. Whatever IESBA has achieved over the last few years, Galen was kind to mention some of these. These are not really my achievement. They are the achievement of a big collectivity of people, the board, the staff, and the CAG. I think the CAG has been very important. And I like the fact that the CAG is made up of people who are courageous, and when they have a different opinion, when they have a different angle of things, they do not hesitate to say it. And I assure you that I personally, and all of us, have been very careful to listen to that, because, you know, I have my feeling of my conception of the job of global standard setting is that clearly you need very wide and very serious consultation. And the CAG has been the foundation of our consultation strategy. And of course, a global standard setter who engages in global consultation must be willing to entertain not a democracy of majority views and minority views, but a democracy of concepts, hearing different concepts, hearing different approaches, and acting on them as much as we can. And I think the CAG has been very crucial in that job, because number one, of the high quality of individuals that we have in the CAG, all of you, but number two, because you come from, you represent different organizations and different backgrounds, and this has been every time we meet, and we've met many times now, for me, this has been a useful experience that I go away with lessons learned. I want to thank you deeply and from my heart for all that, and I hope that our paths will cross again on another occasion. So be well, be healthy, be productive, and be strong in carrying your views in the public interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stavros. And with that, we'll end our meeting until March. Thank you all.
Goodbye.
Thank you
Bye.
very much. Good
Thank you
luck
very
to
much.
Stavros.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, Stavros.
Thank you.
Thank you all.